As an avid fan of the tight end position, you know that I am loving all of the scoring that tight ends are doing so far in 2025. In fact, let me just make a little bit of a comparison to how good the position is this year compared to last season, because in 2025, we have one tight end over 60 fantasy points through 5 weeks. We have 3 tight ends at 50 or more. We have 12 tight ends at 40 or more, and 22 total tight ends that have more than 30 fantasy points so far this season. But in 2024, wasn't nearly as good. At this point last year, there were no tight ends that had scored 60 fantasy points. There was only 2 tight ends that had scored 50, 5 that had scored 40, and 13 tight ends that totaled 30 or more fantasy points through 5 weeks. In fact, here's the thing. Last season, it took 7 weeks for 13 tight ends to score more than 40 fantasy points. And considering we're already at 12 tight ends over 40, I would say we're doing solid this season. And on Thursday Night Football, we may have a solid matchup of tight ends once again, Dallas Goedert and Theo Johnson. And I'm liking Dallas Goedert a little bit more on Thursday Night Football. And right now, he's going to be a fringe start for me. Not a great matchup against the Giants. One of the things that they're doing well, 9th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, 7th fewest receiving yards, and they've only allowed 1 touchdown to opposing tight ends so far this season. Now, Dallas Goedert's going to look to make that at least 2. He's got 3 touchdowns in 3 straight games right now, even though the overall volume is not great. Now, yes, last week he had 9 targets. That's great. But the 2 weeks combined prior to that, he had 6 targets and 5 receptions. That is not solid in terms of volume. And this year, with as much scoring as we have at the tight end position and quite a few different options that we haven't had in years past, you may not necessarily need to risk it with a guy like Goedert on Thursday Night Football. But hey, if you want that upside, more than welcome to go with it. This one could end up biting me in the butt. But I've got Theo Johnson listed as a sit this week. And that was after I listed him as a start last week and had a lot of people run to the waiver wire to grab him if they were dealing with any issues at the tight end position. That worked out well. This week, I don't love the matchup nearly as much. Philadelphia allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game and the 4th fewest receiving yards, while allowing the 6th fewest receptions and only 1 touchdown to tight ends. Now, the touchdown was last week to Evan Ingram, but Philadelphia has faced Jake Ferguson and Travis Kelce as well, and they've still held them to pretty legitimately substandard days. If you play him, you definitely have to bank on him scoring a touchdown. He's got 3 TDs over the last 2 weeks, so it's absolutely possible. But there's something to be said about taking a little too much risk on Thursday Night Football, depending on other options that you might have for later in the week. For Denver and the New York Jets, over across the pond in London once again, I'm going to go with Evan Ingram as a start. What I saw from him last week is what I feel like we need to start putting him back in our lineup. And going up against the Jets, allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to tight ends, plus the most touchdowns to tight ends, I like Evan Ingram to potentially find the end zone once again. Now, he had 6 targets last week, which was 2nd on the team. Give me Evan Ingram plus 6 targets in a really solid matchup as much as possible. Mason Taylor, I feel like we have to start. And Denver does well against tight ends. Right now, they're allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game, the 7th fewest receptions, but they are 19th in receiving yards, which means even though they're allowing the 7th few receptions, they're allowing some pretty big plays to tight ends. And over the last 2 weeks, Mason Taylor has 25 targets. And I said last 2 weeks, but it's actually the last 3 weeks. He has 25 targets. So he's doing a solid job in the volume department over the last few weeks. And now in a tougher matchup, but one that could allow for some bigger plays, I like Mason Taylor this week. Even though the volume may not be great and the floor might be lower than what we like, I think he's got a solid ceiling. It's very interesting because I saw Jake responding to a comment about Trey McBride on YouTube after his waiver wire video came out. And the individual was really upset with Trey McBride's performance and wanted to know whether or not he should drop him. And Jake really was like, I don't know if you're kidding or not, But I've also seen a couple of other people be like, I'm not thrilled with the way Trey McBride has played this year, but why? I mean, do you feel like he hasn't lived up to his draft spot? Like, okay, I get that, but I think that has more to do with the fact that we have so many other tight ends playing so well right now that Trey McBride just hasn't separated himself the way he's done in previous years. Right now, he's second in the league in targets, right behind Jake Ferguson. He's third in receiving yards. At least he has a touchdown right now, something he didn't get until the end of last season. Should you be upset with Trey McBride? No, I wouldn't be upset with Trey McBride. There's just a lot of tight ends playing really well right now. He leads the team in targets. Continue to roll him out there. And Tyler Warren, he continues to be another great value at the tight end position as well. He's going to be a start this week. Arizona's allowing the 5th most receiving yards to opposing tight ends. Warren this year has played very well. He's been a top 10 tight end in 4 of 5 games, and he has a touchdown in each of the last 2 weeks. Nothing more to be said. Oronde Gadsden for the Los Angeles Chargers is going to be a fringe start candidate for me. Wasn't on board with him last week. We're going to wrap back to him this week, though, if you're having any issues and you need to stream somebody at the tight end position. Going up against Miami, they've allowed the 8th most fantasy points per game, the 7th most receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns to opposing tight ends so far. But from a numbers standpoint, the matchup this week for the wide receivers is actually a bit more difficult. It's going to be hard to be a consistent fantasy fixture in this lineup because you've got 3 wide receivers essentially ahead of you in the pecking order. And maybe with Omarion Hampton going down, that's going to cause a few more short yardage targets as well. We've seen that with run games in the past that have struggled without their starter or just not playing well. They utilize the tight end in short passing attempts more as running the football than anything. But this is a solid matchup this week. And with it being a tough matchup for the wide receivers, let's see if we can go ahead and get Gadsden going. Darren Waller looks fantastic. I mean, the last time we saw this guy on a field in 2023, he was a shell of his former self. I mean, he wasn't even able to stay on the field in 2021, 2022, or 2023. He dealt with injuries, he was unproductive, and at that point, he decided to step away. And now he has come back, and he looks like prime Darren Waller from 2019 and 2020. That's kind of insane. Now, this matchup is going to be a little bit more difficult. The Los Angeles Chargers allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game, the 5th fewest receiving yards, and they've only allowed 2 receiving touchdowns to tight ends so far on the season. Darren Waller, though, to start the year, tight end 2 and tight end 5. If that's not impressive enough, he's caught 8 of his 9 targets for 105 yards and 3 touchdowns. Yep, the matchup's going to be tough, but he's playing way too well right now to sit. Welcome to the world of trying to figure out when to start Hunter Henry. He plays well enough when it's good production that you kind of got to leave him in your lineup all the time unless you have a safer option. But there's up and downs. Drake May loves him and he looks his way quite a bit, but there's going to be times where he goes off and then he disappears, and that's really what it has been the last couple of weeks. He's got a great matchup against New Orleans, though. New Orleans currently allows the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends, and they've allowed 4 receiving touchdowns through the first 5 weeks to tight ends. But over the last 2 weeks, he only has 6 targets, and that was after 11 targets in a game just 3 weeks ago. So again, you're going to get a huge performance where he gets 11 targets, 10 targets, goes off, scores a touchdown, and then next week you're going to start him and you're going to be like, what in the world? Where did he go to? It is possible that Juwan Johnson is going to be just fine. And it is entirely possible that Taysom Hill is not going to be fantasy relevant as much as the truthers want him to be. Keep in mind something with Taysom Hill, and this is a point that I brought up on the live stream on Sunday morning, talking a little bit more about him. The reason Taysom Hill has been a cheat code the last couple of years is because fantasy owners felt like the tight end position is such a risk. Why not take the risk with a guy who could get me some passing yards, that could get me some rushing yards, that could get me some receiving yards, that could score a touchdown 3 different ways? That was kind of the thought process. But you don't need to risk it like that this year. There's way more fantasy viable options at tight end this year than there ever has been before. It feels like it anyway. And because of that, Taysom Hill is a huge risk these days, especially being the age he is, coming back from the injury he did. It's crazy that he's already back after that leg injury. He should probably be out at least another month or 2, but he's back and he is playing. but he didn't do anything as a tight end this past week. He got some run on the ground, and he got a passing attempt. So maybe this coaching staff feels like Juwan Johnson is the answer. And we don't need to worry about Taysom Hill stealing anything from him because he's not going to play tight end. He's going to be in the backfield. He's going to do some passing stuff, maybe run the football a little bit, but he's not going to be out there receiving. Now, I will say this. I'll keep an eye on it. Juwan Johnson still top 5 in targets at the tight end position. And I understand if you say, hey, I want to sit him for a couple of games to really see how Taysom Hill ends up being a part of this offense. And if you want to do that, I get that because once again, there's a lot more options this year. So why take the risk? David Njoku and Harold Fannin have a solid matchup this week. And even though David Njoku was the volume guy last week, Harold Fannin still scored a touchdown as well. So maybe Dillon Gabriel is going to be best friends with both of these guys. We would love that. Pittsburgh is allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game. And last week, David Njoku really lit up the box score. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 67 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Fannin, not nearly as much. 4 targets, 4 receptions, scored a touchdown. Not a ton of yards to go with him last week. Is David Njoku going to be that guy moving forward? Hopefully. Hopefully Dillon Gabriel is the guy to get him going because Joe Flacco, who's now in Cincinnati, was not the guy. I am definitely willing to start David Njoku again after that performance. And if you dropped him, it was hard to imagine that Flacco was going to be replaced by Gabriel and they were going to look that good right off the bat. So maybe David Njoku still has a little bit of risk moving forward. But for me personally, I like his floor over Harold Fannin because I do think he could be the target over Harold Fannin, while Fannin probably has a little bit more touchdown and big play potential. Pittsburgh coming out of the bye, potentially issues running the football against that Cleveland defense. I'll give Jonnu Smith another shot, even though he only has 1 top 12 performance this year, and his other 3 were completely outside the top 25. Now, I mentioned this a couple of minutes ago with the Chargers. If you have trouble moving the football on the ground, sometimes you can utilize that short passing game with your tight ends instead. And that's why I'll take a look at Jonnu Smith, but he is on the very back end of my starter rankings this week. Anybody that I talk about is a sit or a fringe sit, Jonnu Smith is way closer to being a sit than he is an actual start. So we're only really risking it with Smith if we absolutely have to. After scoring 20 fantasy points last week, Jake Ferguson has exploded to the top of the tight end leaderboard for fantasy points this season. That's in half PPR leagues. In a full PPR league, he was already there, but now he's got an even bigger gap at this point. Now he gets a matchup against Carolina, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game, the most receiving yards, and have also allowed 3 receiving touchdowns on the season so far. If Jake Ferguson isn't the tight end 1 this week, then I don't know where you have him ranked. Tommy Tremble, I missed on him last week. I thought he might be a pretty safe option, even if he didn't have that great of a floor, but Bryce Young spread the ball around last week for Carolina. 10 different players had at least 1 target last week. Tommy Tremble only had 2. This is a solid matchup, but he wasn't used last week, so in my opinion, I'm just going to stay away from him this week. I teetered on the AJ Barner start and sit decision the same way I teetered on it with Theo Johnson, and ultimately, it came up to me feeling like this was a better matchup with AJ Barner, especially considering how well Sam Darnold played last week. Now, to me, Elijah Arroyo isn't really that big of a concern. Last week, AJ Barner had 7 targets, caught all 7 of them for 53 yards and 2 touchdowns, actually. He played 80% of the snaps. Elijah Arroyo, 1 target, 1 reception, 10 yards, and only played 43% of the snaps. AJ Barner, very solid in the red zone. Hopefully he offers some big play potential along the way as well. Just a quick story about Brenton Strange before I start talking about him, but my son is playing in his first fantasy football league this year. I'm also in it with him. And him and I were playing against each other, and he's undefeated with the top scoring team in the league. And he has made sure that he lets me know every single day since the season started how good his team is. And congratulations. I absolutely love to see that. It shows that he pays attention when we talk football. But last night, he needed 6 fantasy points from Brenton Strange to beat me. I hate seeing an injury, and this is me not victory lapping that whatsoever. But when he woke up this morning and saw that he had his first loss to me, I had to laugh a little bit. Unfortunately, it does sound like Brenton Strange is going to be missing for a few weeks at the least. Hip flexor, quad, it's something at this point. It hasn't been said by Jacksonville, which stinks because this is a really good matchup for him. Going up against Seattle, allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game, the most receptions, the 8th most receiving yards, 3 touchdowns allowed. We'll keep an eye on his health over the week, but unfortunately, I don't know if I would go with anybody else at the tight end position. But if I decide to do that, I'll let you know later on. For the LA Rams and the Baltimore Ravens, I don't really see a whole lot here that's getting me excited to play a tight end in this matchup. Tyler Higbee was inactive last week. He could be inactive again, but in his stead, Allen saw 2 targets, Ferguson had 1, and Parkinson had 1. They combined for 4 targets, 3 receptions, and 45 yards. I have no interest. Even if Higbee does come back, they've got a rotation of like 4 3 tight ends right now. For Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, Cooper Rush was terrible last week, and I highly doubt he's any better this week against the Rams. So until Lamar Jackson is back, I probably won't be discussing either of these guys as an option. I just can't get myself on board with starting Chiggy Okonkwo this week, and it is a testament once again to how good the tight end position has been in 2025, because last week he had 4 receptions for 48 yards, and in the past, 6.8 fantasy points would be good enough to kind of have you as like a fringe tight end 1. I'm not kidding. This year, it was only good enough for the tight end 21. This is also a tough matchup. Las Vegas is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so I just can't get on board with it. Brock Bowers is week to week, according to Pete Carroll, so I highly doubt we see him on the field this week. Clearly, he's a sit if he doesn't play, and I do think he'll probably be out again. You guys remember Albert, are you okay? He was a fun potential breakout candidate a couple of years ago in Denver. Did absolutely nothing and kind of disappeared into the abyss. Well, now he's going to get another shot in Las Vegas. Am I going to take the shot with him? No, I'm not going to. But hey, if Albert Are You Okay could have a huge day, that'd be a whole lot of fun to see. Right before I started recording tight ends, we found out that Joe Flacco was being traded to the Cincinnati Bengals. And for as bad as things started for him in Cleveland this year, you gotta think that he's gonna be better than Jake Browning has been. Jake Browning was solid in the second half last week, but in the first half, it was a disaster, and it hasn't been good since Joe Burrow went down. The veteran leadership from Flacco will definitely help. But let me tell you something, okay? When I walk into a car dealership and I see all of these cars sitting in front of me, and my budget allows me to buy something that's on the showroom, something super nice, a sports car, a high-end truck, something that when I drive it down the street, people are gonna look. If my budget allows me to do that, I'm gonna test drive those vehicles. You know what I'm not gonna test drive? The beat up 86 Honda that's sitting off to the side for $1,000 that they're just trying to get rid of. I'm sorry, but that's what it would be like if Joe Flacco walks into Cincinnati and starts giving Mike Gesicki, Noah Fant, or whoever else a bunch of targets. Drive the Lambos. Drive the high-end trucks. Go with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, for the love of God. Tucker Kraft will be a start this week. He's got a great matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow the most fantasy points per game and the 4th most receiving yards to opposing tight ends. But please do not let that overshadow the fact that Tucker Kraft has 1 tight end 1 performance this year. It was massive, and it's one of the reasons why he's as high among the tight end scorers as he is. He's not nearly as safe as what you think, but I will roll with him this week. San Francisco at Tampa Bay, and could it be the return of our favorite tight end, George Kittle? And you know what? To celebrate the potential return of George Kittle, let's talk about our friends over at Tushy. The only people I've met that love tight ends more than myself, and honestly, probably George Kittle. And even though I'm talking about tight ends the football kind, Tushy's more interested in helping out the real tight ends. And Tushy has some incredible products. If you're looking to take better care of your tight end, then I would ask the people over at Tushy for some help with that. And right now, our Headliner Nation family and community here get 10% off of your purchase over at Tushy by following the link in the description down below or using code HEADLINERS at checkout. On Monday and Tuesday, Kittle was at practice. He was running around, he was participating in some solo drills. Is he going to be ready to go this week? We don't know about that quite yet, but we will continue to monitor it throughout the week. And if he does start against Tampa Bay this week, we will move him from the IR to a start as well. We had a Cade Otton sighting last week, and do you know how much it doesn't matter? He was still only the tight end 13. Since 2022, which was Cade Otton's rookie season, he has only had back-to-back games with top 12 performances one time, and that was in 2024 from week 7 through 9. He had 3 straight top 12 performances. Outside of that, Cade Otton has never been a back-to-back top 12 tight end in his career. For Detroit and Kansas City on Sunday Night Football, Sam Laporta has a really tough matchup. Kansas City is currently allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the tight end position, mainly because they haven't allowed a touchdown to a tight end as of yet this year. Sam Laporta has been a top 6 tight end twice, but he also has 3 performances outside the top 20. I'll list him as a fringe start because of the potential back and forth in this matchup, and because it's the Lions offense, which is one of the best in football right now. So you got to at least think that he could give you some solid top 15 numbers, hopefully. Travis Kelce's best performance this year came last week in week 5, and he's got 3 top 12 performances now on the season, and he's up to tight end 6. So Travis Kelce has worked out a lot better this year than he did last year. But with big plays being allowed to wide receivers by the secondary in Detroit, and with how banged up that secondary is, to me, Travis Kelce is going to be more of an afterthought this week. He's probably going to see a lot of Brian Branch. We know Jack Campbell can drop back in coverage. Alex Anzalone can drop back in coverage. All 3 of those guys do a good job against tight ends and trying to limit them. So for me this week, Travis Kelce just doesn't have the same upside. Dalton Kincaid gets a really tough matchup this week going up against Atlanta, currently allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. But Dalton Kincaid, he's on a hot streak. 3 straight top 12 performances. He's got 4 out of 5 total now. And you know what I'm glad to see? I'm glad to see him inside the top 10 based on volume and not just touchdowns alone. Those were concerns we had a couple of weeks ago. And if he keeps up with his volume, they won't be concerns anymore. Before the bye, Kyle Pitts had a solid week. He was the tight end 4 overall. But it's the only game this season that he's been higher than tight end 18. And now he's getting the Buffalo Bills, who allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Don't love the ceiling this week. Chicago at Washington. There's not much to say about the Chicago tight ends. Maybe during the bye week, we've seen a little bit of game planning. Maybe Ben Johnson is going to get him a little bit more involved. But until I see it consistently, and I'm talking like at least 3 straight weeks, the tight end position is a wasteland. And I have no idea what happened last game to Zach Ertz, but a few people were like, hey, what happened? Where did he go to? I have no idea what happened last game. Debo, Luke McCaffrey, JCM, Jalen Lane, Jeremy McNichols all had more targets than Zach Ertz. I'm going to list him as a start because I would like to see him get back up on the horse and be good for a couple of weeks because the last 3 weeks have not been bad. And I thought that was because of Marcus Mariota, but unfortunately it was also with Jaden Daniels last week. Headliner Nation, hopefully this start and sit video has helped you start to make some decisions on what you want to do with your lineup in week 6. Make sure you hit the like button, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell notifications. We've still got wide receiver and quarterbacks to come out for start and sit. And if you missed running backs, make sure you check that out as well. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.